Hello, welcome to Show and Tell Meg. I'm Megan and I like to make things. And I recently finished my Rose Street cardigan and I thought that I would give a review on what I thought of it. This is my completed sweater. It is a pattern by Sydney Craybaugh, who has a Patreon called Squid School of Vintage Knitting. And the cool thing about her patterns is they're completely size inclusive. You put in your measurements into certain places and she talks you through how to use those measurements to make the pattern fit you. Like we're not talking that you're doing every single calculation yourself, but you're getting your base measurements. She gives you a measurement chart that you take, your bust, your waist. You take more detailed measurements than you typically do for knitting patterns. You get like your distance between your shoulders, your distance from here to here, your waist to your high hip and low hip and things like that. But the result, once you get those measurements, you plug them in and she assigns it a letter and then you use that letter to figure everything else. And the result is a sweater that fits you completely. I love vintage patterns, but I wear a 40-inch bust. And if you look into vintage patterns much, you'll know that most of them don't come that big. There's a few for sure, but back then they assumed that you had a much larger knitting knowledge than we typically have today, unless you've been a knitter for a really long time. They assumed that you knew how to fit things, that you knew how to gauge swatch and reverse engineer this pattern from the, 34 or 32-inch bust that it's written for and alter it to fit you. And that knowledge, while it's not some big mystery, it is definitely doable. It's not as commonly known anymore. Like, we don't all learn to knit when we're little kids. We don't have that as a tradition that's handed down from our mothers or grandmothers or whatever. We don't have that working knowledge like they used to have for generations. And so it's definitely something that has eluded me. And I have taken a vintage pattern that was made for a smaller bust. I completed earlier this year. It was so much trial and error though. I ended up I got the entire front done. It was essentially a vest and I saw that it was too big. I had to rip all the way back down on both front panels. I had to fudge a lot of things to make it fit because my calculations, while they were somewhat correct, they weren't as precise as this pattern is orchestrated to be. And so the glory of these patterns is that you're not going to have to do all of that trial and error. You're not going to have to knit the entire front of a sweater and then find out that it didn't fit. I was able to knit this entire sweater in about 2 months, which is extremely fast for me for a fingering weight sweater. I typically take, I think the fastest I've ever made one before this was probably 4 months, and that was a 3/4 sleeve cropped sweater. I am not super fast typically with fingering weight sweaters. I usually always have one going and they're kind of my back burner project. And I love to work on them, but I'll set them aside a lot to make other things. This time though, this was pretty much my exclusive project aside from like a couple of really small things that I made. So I was able to whip this out remarkably fast, in my opinion, for me. Also, this is my first ever bishop sleeve, which I really love. So let's talk about the details of the pattern. So the body of the sweater is just basic stockinette, simple V-neck. The nice thing about the button band is it is knitted, or it's a knit purl going vertically, which in the vintage pattern that I made, you actually had to knit this tiny strip separately and then sew it on, which I'll be real, kind of sucked. This one has you knitted at the same time, which is really great, except that I'm not necessarily the greatest at paying attention to how many rows I've just knit when I'm doing mindless stockinette. And so my buttons are not exactly even. I don't think that you would notice that if I didn't tell you, but in fairness, I'm going to let you know. That's why there's a bit more distance here than there is like here. It should have been more like these. It is what it is. I don't think anyone's going to notice while I wear it, so it doesn't really bother me. Another cool detail is that this sweater has a ribbed yoke on the front and the back. And this actually has worked out really awesome for me. I have very narrow shoulders for the size of the rest of my frame, and it's a constant problem when I'm knitting things or sewing things. Like, I'm always having to alter to make my shoulders narrower. And this one, I mean, grant you, it was done to my measurements, but also, even if it was a smidge wide here, that ribbing really pulls things in. See, like, if I needed it to be wider, it could accommodate that, but I don't need it to be wider, so it's able to just cinch in, which is awesome. The sweater also has puffed sleeves, and the sleeves are really kind of the whole point of this sweater, in my opinion. It has a really pretty, very simple lace detail that is repeated, same throughout the whole thing, extremely easy to memorize. And yeah, just a nice little bit of a droop in the sleeve, not sleeves that are so big that you're going to catch them on everything, just enough, you know, for a little drama. And yeah, I was immediately drawn to this sweater, which this is the example photo, just to show, which I love the color that she made here. I did look into buying this yarn. It's a little out of my budget, but it's beautiful. And I'm really happy with how mine turned out in comparison to the example photo. One thing that is a little different on mine than the example is my buttons are definitely a little smaller. I had this card of vintage buttons. They are actually brown. I will put in a close-up photo of them, but they have this really cool iridescence. These are probably from the 40s or the 50s, judging by the card that I got them off of. And I was really excited about the comparison. They just looked really nice with my yarn choice. And then when I was sewing them on, I miscounted. I only had 7 buttons and I needed 8. So my final button down here is a different button. But as you can see, it is the same size. It's slightly iridescent, similar kind of body color to the others. If I didn't point that out to you, I don't think you would notice. I'll insert a close-up photo just so that you can see what I'm talking about. And yeah, I'm really happy with how covert that ended up, because that could have gone way worse. I was standing there just going, no way. How did I not count this correctly? But in the end, it all worked out just fine. And I feel like it definitely stayed with that 40s kind of spirit, like make, do, and mend, because there was certainly no finding more of these buttons. I don't even know what thrift store I got them at, but you know, I got them at a thrift store. So there is no going back to the store and buying some more. You just get what you get. The inside of my button band is completely stabilized and backed. I did an entire tutorial on how to do this, filming while I made this sweater. It's really not difficult to do. It is a little time consuming, but it is my favorite way to finish off any hand knit sweater. And what it is you take Petersham ribbon and you machine stitch buttonholes. You could hand sew the buttonholes onto the ribbon, and then I hand sew that ribbon to the insides. Just makes everything really clean. It finishes off. Like, this sweater didn't have a picked up edge for the button band because it was knit at the same time. But on other sweaters that I've made where you have picked up, you get this ridge of stitches. And so I find that this just covers over everything. It makes it really clean on the inside, gives kind of a more professional finish, in my opinion. And this is something that was really common in vintage sweaters. It also is what has enabled me to be able to use these buttons. They are fine size-wise, but they are a smidge small. And when I first blocked this sweater and put the buttons in, they seemed fine. But after taking them in and out a few times, the buttonholes have definitely stretched out, and it's only because of my stabilized button band inside that these don't just slide right through. So that's another advantage of backing your button band. It makes everything lay really smoothly while you wear it. Looks nice when you flash it. Like if you were to find some kind of a decorative Petersham ribbon, I've done that before and that looks really pretty. I've used jacquard ribbons that are really pretty. But yeah, I just think it makes everything just a little bit extra finished inside, and I really like the result of that. As far as the sweater itself, I knit this with just over 7 skeins of Knit Pick Stroll. This is in the Duchess Heather colorway, and it's just a really pretty plummy purple. Like what I'm seeing on the screen is pretty close. It's maybe a tiny smidge darker than what it's coming across there, but just a really nice purple for the clothes that I tend to wear. This is going to match a lot of things, and I knew that going in. I originally bought this yarn when it was super duper on sale, and I bought 6 skeins, not knowing what I was going to make with it. But then as soon as this sweater pattern was released last April, I immediately earmarked this yarn for it. And then when Knit Picks had another sale later on, I picked up 2 more skeins, and I am really glad that I did. That is one of the slight downfalls of this type of pattern. Because you are customizing it to fit you, you don't have an exact yardage depending on your size, which technically I don't have that on most of the sweaters that I make because I'm usually extending the body length. I have a long torso. And so usually I look at the recommended amount of yarn and I think, okay, I'm probably going to need maybe a little bit more than that. This one did recommend if you were 40-inch bust or under, you would have 1,400 yards. So I just checked my Ravelry to make sure, and I did go over that 1,400 yards that's recommended. But given that I have a long torso, fairly long arms, I knew that it was going to go over, and that's why I bought those 2 extra skeins. I ended up using 1,674 yards, which was 7 1/4 skeins of the yarn. So I actually bought exactly enough, which I'm very grateful for. But for a long sleeved fingering weight sweater, to me, that is pretty appropriate. Most of my other fingering weight sweaters that I've made have been shorter in the body, probably cropped to about right at waist level, and 3/4 sleeve, and they've used somewhere between 13 and 1,400. So I really knew going in that it was going to take a little more yarn than what was suggested here, and that's why I ordered those extra 2 skeins. That said, I love Knit Pick Stroll yarn. This is honestly one of my favorite yarns. I have used it for socks. I've used it for sweaters. My other vintage sweater that I made is made in this exact same yarn. And it's just so soft. The colors are really nice. It's very affordable. They put it on sale all the time. It's just a really great yarn. I will say it's maybe a smidge heavy, and that's why my sleeves aren't poofing up quite as much as I would like. I'm honestly kind of contemplating knitting like a little shoulder pad in my excess yarn, but we'll see. I like it like it is. You still get a little bit of poof. It's just not anything ridiculous. We're not Anna Green Gables here, but it's just that little 40s poof, and I think it worked out really good for this pattern. But that is something to keep in mind. I wonder, I haven't used the recommended yarn that she used for the pattern, so I'm not sure if that's like a lighter weight yarn than Knit Pick Stroll, because this is a sock yarn. It has nylon in it. So that is something to maybe keep in mind. But it definitely worked out great for this sweater. Until making this sweater, I did have a little bit of a head boggle about doing the sleeves. Like I know how to set in a sleeve, but making these slightly puffed sleeves, I've made one other Sydney puff sleeve pattern, which was the Florist Bolero. And that was the first time I ever did it. It was a real short one, so I thought that's a great way to try out this type of pattern. And it worked out good. It fits me well. And she walks you through how to put the sleeve in a video on her Patreon account, which is fine if you can find it. I had a very hard time, like the pattern will even say see the video on Patreon, and unless you type in the exact keywords that that tutorial is tagged with, it just doesn't come up. And so it was always a little frustrating every time I've tried to look up how to do it. Thankfully, though, her newest pattern, the Four Seasons dress and skirt and blouse pattern, has an actual written tutorial on how to set in the sleeve and to get the puff. And this worked out fantastically because I had just printed out that sweater. I love it. I want to make it really soon. And I happened to be looking through the pattern. I saw that at the end, it talks about setting in the sleeves. And I was having trouble at that time setting in this sleeve because I couldn't remember at what rate you pick up. Like, to achieve the puff, you're skipping a certain number of stitches in between each stitch that you actually sew to the arm side. So you skip all these stitches and then you go back afterwards and you reinforce that little section that you have now made. That's all these zigzaggy sections that make the puff. You go back in and out of that to tighten everything together, and that's how you get the puff. I didn't do that the first time. I completely set in both sleeves and I had almost no puff whatsoever. And it was honestly kind of a bummer. And I had already pulled one out because I was going to be experimenting with it. And then I saw that that pattern included the written instructions, and I was like, yes, this is exactly what I'll do. I did that and I never had any more problems. I have only made a few of Sydney's patterns, but they have both turned out really nicely, and I absolutely plan on making more. I have been a member of her Patreon for, I don't know, a year and a half, something like that. And there are so many cute sweaters. If you like vintage style clothes, but don't fit into vintage sizes, or if you want to make little adjustments that aren't accommodated for in the vintage patterns, which they're very bare bones, I'll be honest, her stuff is just the perfect blend because she has gone through the work of making this pattern where it will work for modern sizing. And she's done the work to where you just plug in some numbers and it'll fit you. So I can't recommend her patterns enough. I love how they're written. I love how they fit when everything is said and done. And yeah, I will definitely be making more. If you are at all inclined to this style, I definitely recommend giving it a try. It is a 5-star pattern for me. So yeah, this is my newest finished sweater, and I'm thrilled with the results. I wish it wasn't May to where I could actually get to wear this outside. It is way too hot to wear this outside in Florida now, and it won't be cold enough until the fall. But because this is a fingering weight sweater, I find that they work really well indoors in the air conditioning in the summer when things are just really a little too chilly. They can take the edge off. Also, because this has that lace detail, I think that it's gonna breathe a little better. I foresee this being a really useful sweater to keep in my bag at work. So yeah, something to look put together but still throw on and feel comfortable is always a good thing in my book. I hope that you found this review useful. If you are looking at making this and have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them if I am able. Please leave your questions in the comments. If you have questions about this yarn or how I did any of these things, I will link my tutorial for backing the button bands down below as well. It's my favorite way of finishing anything. I feel like a broken record now. But if you are at all inclined for that, I hope that you give that one a watch. And yeah, I can't say enough good things about this sweater. I love it. I would make more. I may make more in the future because it's just really cute and comfy, and it was very easy and quick to make. So yeah, that is about all I have to say about this sweater. I hope that you liked this review. If you did, please give me a like, subscribe if you want to see more about the things that I make. And yeah, until next time, happy knitting.